Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Man, it's been ages since I've said that. Yeah, the last 3 months have been kind of pretty quiet on the Absurd Being front. Work just kind of squeezed out anything else that I might have wanted to do. So hopefully that has finished and we can move forward, get some good philosophy done. So that's what this video is about. We're going to look at Watsuji Tetsuro. That's the series will be about him, and we'll focus on ethics, his book Ethics. I'll also talk about climate and culture a little bit, but that's going to be the main focus of the series. Climate and culture will just take up this video, actually. We'll talk a little bit about that, and then next video and every video after, we will break down the ethics. So let's talk a little bit about Watsuji Tetsuro himself first. So Watsuji was born in 1889, died in 1960. So he kind of was born into the Meiji period in Japan, which was a period where there was a lot of interest in and influx of Western ideas into Japan, including in philosophy. So Watsuji's philosophy is full of references to people like Kant, Hegel, Husserl, Heidegger, Scheller. He was really well educated in Western philosophy, and he sees, I think, his philosophy kind of coming on the back of these, in particular, phenomenologists, and so he's really carrying on that tradition and filling in places where he sees that there was some that things were lacking, things were missing in Western philosophy, but like I say, phenomenology in particular. When you think of Japanese philosophy, you probably think of one guy mainly, Nishida Kitaro, probably, and that's because he has just come to embody Japanese philosophy, and he was associated with this group of thinkers that has become known as the Kyoto School. And it wasn't an official school, or it wasn't like an official institute or anything. Basically, the Kyoto School was one of the earliest and the most well-known schools in Japanese philosophy. But basically, like I say, it wasn't an official group of people or a place where people studied. It's more defined by thinkers' proximity to Nishida, to his ideas and his philosophy. So it's more like a school of ideas, if you like, and centered around Nishida. He's like the nucleus of this school, and very much Buddhist in tone and tenor. So the Kyoto School is heavily influenced by Buddhism, and there's a lot of, it's Buddhist philosophy essentially. And so that's probably who you're thinking of if you know anything about Japanese philosophy. And I feel a little bit guilty setting up this YouTube channel or whatever. I created a playlist called Japanese philosophy, because I'm not going to look at Nishida, I'm not going to look at Nishitani or any of the other Kyoto School philosophers, just because if you've seen any of my videos, you probably know I'm not particularly keen on Buddhism or any religion. I was in the past, but I've very much moved away from Buddhism, and whatever value I am able to get from Buddhist philosophy, I always have to cull away so much that eventually I just kind of realized, well, there's no point in going into Buddhist philosophy if I have to kind of sift through the detritus to get to these valuable insights. Don't get me wrong, there are some ideas of merit in Buddhism, but you have to sift through so much to get there. And I don't even think I would have found them if I hadn't had a background in philosophy, and like Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty and Sartre. Those guys kind of, I think all of the insights that you get in Buddhist philosophy that are of worth are kind of in other places, in secular philosophy, if you like. So yeah, I steer clear of the Buddhist side of things, which means I'm not going to talk about any of the philosophers from the Kyoto school. And Watsuji is not associated with this school. His thinking was just never close enough to Nishida to ever kind of be included in this group of thinkers. But it's similar. So he does kind of approach his philosophy, and we could call it even phenomenology or existentialist related philosophy. He approaches it from a kind of Buddhist background, but I noticed this in the ethics in particular. He's very wary about overplaying his Buddhist hand. So he kind of treads a fine line, I think. He walks a fine line between the Buddhist and like the Western philosophy. Never incorporating elements tentatively from Buddhism. Obviously nothingness is the big thing, negation, that always comes through. But never fully. He never kind of fully endorses negation the way that someone like Nishida does, for example. So yeah, so we'll look at Watsuji. Made it to my radar because he doesn't have that. His philosophy is not so steeped in Buddhism that I thought there was value in it. It's worth studying. So that's why, hence the series, I guess. So the two books we will be looking at are Climate and Culture, which was written in 1935, and Ethics. Rinrigaku is the Japanese name. Probably not pronouncing that right, but there it is. And that was published in 3 volumes in 1937, 1942, and 1949. And the rest of today's video is going to be about climate and culture. So let's have a look at that. So climate first. What is climate? When in Japanese it's fudo, which literally means wind and earth, and is essentially Watsuji defines it as the natural environment of a given land. But he's not a meteorologist, so we're not talking about climate as a weather phenomenon. We're talking about, actually that was a poor choice of words. We're not talking about weather in that climate in that sense. We're talking about the phenomenon of climate. So remember I said that Watsuji was very influenced by phenomenology. So that's kind of the approach he brings to climate. So we're talking about the phenomenon of climate in the phenomenological sense of phenomenon, which means that he's not interested in climate as an object, climate as kind of a standalone, independent, external element. And he's very much against the idea then of a subject, a fully formed kind of atomic individual encountering an object as a also fully formed, separate, external entity. So he's against the idea that I, as a subject, could encounter climate as an object, and then we can investigate the interactions that happen as a result of that. It's very much against that picture. Instead, he takes the Husserlian approach, or the Brentano maybe approach, with the focus on intentionality. So intentionality is key for Watsuji, as in the manner in which we relate to things. So the way intentionality is always defined as like the directedness of consciousness, or our experience. Our experience is always directed towards something. So that's what he means by intentional here, and which is basically that, the manner in which we relate to things. So it captures the fundamental relation between me and the other thing, but in a way in which I am not an individual standing over and against an external object. So intentionality, the manner in which we're related to things, the directedness of our engagement with things. And this is in turn grounded in Ex-sistere, what he calls Ex-sistere. And that's very much, if you've read Heidegger, that will strike you as very Heideggerian, and it is, because Watsuji had read Heidegger carefully and was like I say, I think he saw himself as taking up the baton from Heidegger and filling out places where that Heidegger hadn't fully gone into. But we'll see that in a moment. So grounded in Ex-sistere. So this idea of obviously existence is kind of the root here. Existence, to exist, but the separation of X from the rest of the word tells us that, and we'll get into this in a little bit towards the end of the video as well, tells us that X as in standing outside, as in not a self-contained whole unity. That's kind of why Watsuji is using this word and why he's writing it in this way, Ex-sistere. But we'll come to that in a minute. But in terms of climate then, intentionality grounded in this Ex-sistere, to be cold or to be hot, to have any relation with climate, I'll just use the example of coldness. To be cold is not for a separate subject to encounter the cold as a separate object, but to discover oneself already outside in the cold. And that already outside doesn't mean like outside the house. It means already outside oneself. And that ties in with this Ex-sistere. Ex meaning standing outside, being outside. So we're outside ourselves in the cold. We're outside this notion of ourselves as a fully formed, self-contained entity. I am not this kind of a thing. I am outside that thing. I am in the environment, in the climate. The cold is a constituting factor in me. So he actually says we constitute ourselves as cold subjects in the cold. And that's what it means to be already outside in the cold, that I am not a fully formed entity encountering this external fully formed entity, but I am being constituted in my very being by the climate, by the coldness. So that's the first point to note. And the second thing is that it's important for Watsuji that we don't think of this as I, so it's not just an individual, but it's we. So he's expanding, again, what was typically in Western philosophy has been a focus on the individual, as kind of like the base unit, if you like, the core unit, and then working from there. That's not where Watsuji starts. He starts with the notion of we. So we takes priority over the I. And again, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves here, but that's kind of the other main point that I wanted to make here. It's not this is related to the ex-sistere again. I am not I within myself, but I am I as formed within this collective. I am already standing outside myself in the we. I'm constituted by society in the same way that I'm constituted by climate. It isn't that an individual standalone entity is encountering climate and encountering the society. I, as this person, this self, is being constituted in relation to these things. And so one way that this is often kind of objected to is that I'm foundational, because we all experience climate differently. We all experience the cold in different ways. Therefore, the reasoning goes, I is kind of like the base level. It's the foundation from which we must start. But Watsuji says we do feel the cold differently. Some people enjoy the cold. Some people don't like it. Some people don't even feel this weather is cold because they've been brought up in a certain place or whatever. But we only feel the cold differently like that because we all feel the same cold in common. So there is this commonality underneath the differences. And that's where Watsuji wants to start. So he identifies this commonality underneath, prior to, more fundamental than the individual and the individuals who are different. And that's the link back to Ex-sistere again. To be is to be out among other eyes. In the same way that we were already outside in the cold, that kind of reasoning applies with other people as well, with the community. And so this notion of ex-sistere is the structure of ourselves as we. Cool. So we discover ourselves in climate, which includes things like cold, heat, humidity, but also things like the soil conditions, topography. All of those features come into climate because they all play a role in forming the individual, forming the self, in constituting me as the person that I am. So climate then, because it has this foundational constitutive role, is an existential. It's a foundational structural element of human existence. It's not just this contingent thing we encounter once we're already formed, once we are already who we are. We don't then encounter this other thing. Rather, we've been formed, molded, shaped in tandem, we've been formed or shaped through these external forces, climate, and other people in particular here, but climate especially in particular. So having to relate to climate like this, like I say, it influences everything about us, how we behave, the things we do. And Watsuji talks about the measures that we take to protect ourselves from the elements. That's different depending on the climate that we live in. Our our culture of food preparation. Do we eat more meat than fish? Do we eat more vegetables? That will all depend on the climate. Even our moods can be inspired by, or our dispositions are influenced by the weather. So climate influences everything for Watsuji. Literature, art, religion, manners, customs, the whole thing, because we always apprehend ourselves in climate, because climate is a fundamental existential. It's a structural feature of human existence. Maybe not the only one, but it's one that has been neglected, Watsuji feels. So what he's doing in climate and culture is just bringing this neglected aspect of our ontology to the fore. In addition to this, he notes that climate is historical. So it's not the case that I'm constituted by climate on my own, starting from scratch, if you like. I'm constituted by climate within this broader historical context. So he calls this, or he says that this is an inheritance of self-apprehension accumulated over the years since the time of our ancestors. So we inherit traditions and customs which have already been formed and influenced by climate. So it's not just an isolated packet, but ex-sistere, already outside in climate, already outside in this broader historical context as well. And essentially it's so important, climate is so important for Watsuji that he says climate then is the agent by which human life is objectivized, and it is here that man comprehends himself. There is self-discovery in climate. And it's worth just paying a little bit of attention to that quote. Climate is the agent by which human life is objectivized. By objectivized, he means the way that when we think about human life, human existence, we make an object of it. That's what it is to think about something, is to create a mental object, if you like. And that's what he means by objectivized. But when we do that, we tend to when we think about human life, we tend to try to get to the pure human existence. What is human existence on its own, if you like? And when we make an object of our lives, of existence, to examine it, to investigate it, we think we have stripped away any kind of influencing factors, and we're getting at this core, what is it to be a human being. But what he's saying here is that climate is the agent by which human life is objectivized. It's already formed that object that we're investigating. Climate is already snuck in there and had a role. So when we're investigating ourselves, human nature, human existence, human life, it's already been structured, constituted by climate, that thing that we're studying. And we tend not to notice that. And so what Watsuji's doing here is just pointing out that climate is this foundational, fundamental, constituting factor in human existence. And that's why he says there's self-discovery in climate, because climate is one of those structural feature elements in human life. So, climate is one of the primary ways for Watsuji, but one of the ways we discover ourselves. But what are we? He asks this question as well at the beginning. What is human being? And he says that he says something we talked about just before as well. It's not just an individual, or it's not even primarily an individual, which is associated with time or temporality, as has been the case for most of Western philosophy. Time has been treated separately, differently from space, because we've seen in prioritizing the individual, we're prioritizing the individual's lifetime of the individual, which happens over time. So temporality or time gets kind of wrapped up in this notion of the individual. It's heavily connected to it in a way that space isn't. But that's what Watsuji's saying. We're not just an individual, we are an individual in society. And that intersubjectivity brings in the spatial aspect, which again, Watsuji feels has been neglected in Western philosophy. So what is a human being? Not just an individual, not primarily temporal in nature, but an individual in society. So temporal and spatial. Structured by time and space. And space then also means climate. Climate is related to the spatial aspect of the human being, and history, that historical aspect that we talked about before, is related and brought in through the temporal aspect. So we've got kind of these two key aspects, each broken up into like three parts. You've got time and space, and the time is you've got two then, time and space, and they're broken up into two kind of subdivisions, if you like. The individual and history on the side of time, and society and climate on the side of space. But those are kind of the two broad, formal, if you like, existential structures that make up a human being. But what Watsuji really wants to emphasize here is that we do have those two dimensions, but they are related. And in particular, he wants to draw our attention to the fact that history and climate, time and space, individual and society, but especially, like I say, for Watsuji, history and climate are intimately connected. So from the very first, climate is historical climate, and history is climatic history. So there is no fundamental separation here. There isn't the time and the space, the temporal and the spatial aspects. They are from the very beginning connected together, interwoven, inextricably. And he also points out that this leads to another duality, the finite and the infinite. So the finite coming in with the individual, interestingly enough with time, which is a very Heideggerian kind of thing to say, and the infinite coming in with space and society, because the society lives on beyond the individual. The individual has a finite lifetime, but the society continues on into the future, right? So anyway, that's just another duality that he mentions here, in addition to those previous ones, space and time. What else? Climate, history, and society, and the individual. Another important point in this opening section is the role that Watsuji gives to transcendence and the other. Now, transcendence, always a loaded word, right? We're not talking about, there's nothing mystical about this. It's not supernatural. It's not like a realm above or over, in addition to the physical or anything like that. Transcendence in the sense of being outside, transcending, literally getting outside of something, being outside, not immanent. And this connects right back to that ex-sistere, right? Ex meaning standing outside. That is transcendence. There's nothing mystical, there's nothing religious or supernatural. It's phenomenological. The idea that the individual is constituted by things that are not the individual, that are outside the individual, as typically conceived. So transcendence then is the structure of human life. And that's, like I said, ex-sistere. We are outside ourselves in time through history. We're outside ourselves in space through community, through other people, and through climate. And so that's kind of the core of what it is to be a human being. Structured in those two ways, space and time, and the way that, or what that means is for the individual, that the individual is constituted by these things outside them, external, hence the importance of transcendence. And this is all brilliant. This is all fantastic. It's great philosophy. This is the strength of the book, I think. And that's the first 19 or 20 pages. The rest, the other 180 or so, Watsuji spends talking about the three main types of climate and the way that people are constituted in relation to them. And so I'm going to go through these very briefly, but the first type of climate is monsoon, and this is a fusion of heat and humidity. He gives Asia and India as examples of countries that have this type of climate. And so what kind of people are constituted in the monsoon climate? Submissive people, resigned people, he says. So in these kinds of countries, we get little cultural progress. Again, because the climate is constitutive in the people, in forming the individuals, the human beings, and the climate produces naturally this kind of submission, which means this resignation, which means that you don't get much cultural progress. The second kind of climate is desert. This is seen in Africa and the Middle East and characterized by dryness, by emptiness, and just a very barren landscape. So there's an absence of vitality in the climate. And this produces people who tend to feel a sense of resistance towards life, who have to struggle against the environment. They have to struggle against the elements, so that influences their character. They inherently struggle against something. But it leads to a propensity for cooperation and tribal life, because you have to work together to survive. And he talks about God, the God of this kind of people who have developed in this kind of climate. Their God is not identified with nature. It's not a nature God, but it's identified more with humans. And so the God of these kinds of people is kind of an overbearing, dominant kind of figure, reflecting that struggle against nature that the individuals have to adopt in their environment. And the third kind of culture, the third kind of climate is meadow, and this is seen in Europe, characterized by a fusion of humidity with dryness. And so this is a very gentle climate and conducive to people with who see order in everything, who have a very reasonable approach, or they use reason in their thinking. And so this leads to kind of science, the scientific mindset. And so lots of progress takes place here. And now you're probably already thinking, this is pretty suspect, just because people have developed or evolved or grown up in a certain climate, that they have these particular traits. It's kind of like stereotyping, right? But what Watsuji says in defense of that is that he's not saying this is the way it must be. It's not that because you're in this kind of climate, you therefore are this kind of person. He's just saying, looking at the people, the way that they are, and looking for reasons for that. It need not have been that way. It may be, the desert climate may have produced a group of people who are slightly different or have a different outlook, but it didn't. It produced these types of people. So he's not saying that you are the way you are because of your climate. He's saying necessarily. He's not saying you are the way you are because of your climate necessarily, but in looking at the people, he's asking, why are they that way? And because climate is this existential, it's a part of what constitutes the individuals and the groups of people in a certain area, then that must have played a role in forming them, in creating them and their dispositions and their tendencies. And so he's just like linking the two. He's connecting the two. But he's not saying that if you were born in a monsoon climate, then you must be submissive, and everybody will be submissive. He's just identifying that trait in people in that type of climate, and making a connection, because we know, according to Watsuji, that climate is an existential. It is a structural constitutive element in human existence. So that's what he says anyway. However, I find this whole thing unconvincing, or not unconvincing, but not philosophy, actually. Not philosophy. So yeah, this whole 180 pages was not as interesting as the first section. And the reason is that, well, what we've done essentially is we've gone from the phenomenon of climate, which was both existential and ontological. It was concerned with human existence as a universal, and it was concerned with the structure of human existence, how it is that human beings are human beings. That's what I mean when I say ontological. So it was both of those things, the phenomenon of climate. And then we moved to these kind of less interesting generalizations and stereotypes, which are neither existential nor ontological. Things like, Germans are melancholic naturally, or Indians are submissive. And then you get kind of a little bit forced justifications for this. So he says something about, I forget which country it was, but it may have been India, and the way that they invaded another country, or invaded, but invaded is not quite the right word, but this is what he says. They didn't take over the country by force. They didn't directly try and implant their ideas in the culture overtly. Rather, they slipped in kind of through the back door, through a religious kind of movement perhaps, or through subtle machinations. They didn't directly take over, as would say a more conquering, aggressive type of people, and that's because they are by nature submissive and resigned, right? They're not this kind of attacking, aggressive race, already kind of specious, right? Already it doesn't really match reality. It's more like trying to fit reality into the generalization that Watsuji has given for this kind of for Indians. So yeah, problems with that already. And it's not so much the generalizations. I was trying to think about what it is specifically that I don't like, and that's one of it. That's one of them is that you do end up once you've got this kind of theory, when you make a generalization out of it, then you have to try and squeeze everything that happens into this generalization, and it doesn't always fit. And I think that's a good example. I mean, it works in some cases. You could say that Buddhism, for example, spread not through conquering different countries, but through this kind of subtle religious seeping of ideas. You can say that, but it's like, okay, so Indians, there were no Indian armies. No Indians attacked other nations. It doesn't stack up at the end of the day, because it's just a generalization. And that's kind of what one of the reasons that I think this fails. Generalizations, being what they are, don't apply to all situations. They're a very broad brush kind of stereotyping of a group of people that has to overlook so much in order to stand. And it's useful, that generalizations are useful in certain contexts, but they are kind of clumsy and imprecise, So, for example, how many Germans are melancholic? So how many Germans have to be melancholic for Germans as a whole to be melancholic? Is it like 40%, 50%, 60%? And how do you measure that melancholy? I mean, if someone's melancholic, twice a day? Do they qualify as melancholic? Well, there are so many problems with this that although generalizations aren't useless, they are of, I think, limited and kind of informal use in situations where that type of rudimentary rule of thumb kind of assessment is sufficient. And this is usually in things like a practical ontic, to bring in a Heideggerian term, ontic projects. So maybe something like, I was trying to think of examples, but maybe like having to know the average height of a particular group of people. If you're making a roller coaster, for example, you might need to know how tall the average citizen is in order to build the ride. And there it's useful, right? A generalization is useful, but you're not getting anything existential or ontological out of that. There's no philosophy going on. And that's really, I think, my main problem with this. There are two, I think, extreme places where existentialism and ontology, or the existential / ontological insights that Watsuji makes, can be philosophically applied. And that is, at one extreme, at the universal or the formal, where we talk about what it is to be a human being. All human beings share this and have this in common. They're all structured by, constituted by climate, for example. To be human is to be in a climate. That's a good example of this universal, formal, structural insight. So there are no specific details. No, we're not talking about individuals at that level. And the other place where this has philosophical relevance, I think, is at the level of the individual. So very specific, investigating how and why a specific person is the way they are or does the things that they do. And so this respects the individual response to existentials like climate. Instead of making the individual fit this mold, which applies in a very broad brush sense to a group, we can drill down on this particular individual's response to it. For example, I think the way Merleau-Ponty talks about the way that we take up things, and the way that we take up things gives us a distinctive style. And the phenomenological, ontological insights can be applied to that. Sartre does something similar with, he talks about fatigue and being and nothingness, the way that two different people relate to fatigue in a different way. One person might find it as like a spur to them to push through it, to struggle harder, whereas someone else might want to just give up. So it respects that individual reaction. And his whole existential psychoanalysis was about that, right? Investigating, taking these insights, these ontological insights, but applying them to the individual. And that, look at what he did with Flaubert, right? Trying to analyze and understand him through these existential ontological, through this existential ontological approach. But I think where existentialism and ontology doesn't have philosophical value is in the middle, in between these two extremes. So talking about groups of people. So, for example, just take the Germans, a melancholic, the melancholy of a group. Let's just assume you can measure melancholy and get a figure, for example. But that figure may not even apply to any individual person. No one person might have that particular level of melancholy. Yet that's our generalization, even though it applies to no one. So it has no use at an individual level, at that level of the specific individual. And so what you end up doing is kind of fudging the differences to get the generalization to apply, which is never good for philosophy. But it also has problems being finding use at the level of the universal as well, because it's not saying anything about human existence in general. It's only trying to say something about this particular group. So it gives us a contingent ontic result, which is really useful for practical or for maybe demographic reasons. So this makes it more sociological rather than anything else. And that's kind of, I think, where that captures the sense of disappointment I had reading Climate and Culture. At the very beginning, I was kind of skeptical going into it. It's climate, how philosophical is this going to be? But then I think he's dead right that the opening was really good, excellent philosophy. But then it kind of devolved. It just switched into a different domain, I guess, more sociological than philosophy. So that's kind of my recommendation with climate and culture. If you're looking for some philosophy, read the first 20 pages and then go to ethics. But if you're interested in the more sociological dimension of it, then read the next 180 pages as well. So let's have a look at a summary. So first we talked about climate, but climate as phenomenon in the sense of phenomenology. And so this meant that intentionality was going to play an important role, and intentionality was grounded in Ex-sistere, that standing outside, capturing that notion that we aren't an individual, discrete subject encountering a separate, discrete object. Rather, the object is constitutive. It goes into creating the individual that I am. And so we were ex-sistere, we were standing outside in two ways. In the first, in climate, and in the second, in society, which meant that we had to prioritize the we over the I. And those weren't the only two ways, but those were the two ways that Watsuji wants to focus on and emphasize because he feels they've been neglected in Western philosophy. Then we looked at a human being. What is a human being? And Watsuji's conclusion is a human being is a transcendence, that ex-sistere, that standing outside oneself, being outside oneself, structured by time, including the individual and history, and equally space, which included society and climate. And remember the connection there. There aren't two separate things, time and space, individual and society, history and climate. They are from the beginning interwoven. So Watsuji's emphasis there was on climate and history. From the beginning, climate is historical climate, and history is climatic history. And then we looked at climate itself, which was broken up into those three types by Watsuji: monsoon, desert, and meadow. And we looked at the way that this analysis yielded sociological generalizations and stereotypes, and really drifted away from the philosophy, I thought. Okay, so that is climate and culture. And in the next video, we will start looking at ethics, rinrikaku, which is I wholly endorse. So climate and culture was a little tentative in my recommendations of this book, my endorsements of this one. But ethics, if you're going to read Watsuji, I reckon ethics is the way to go. But anyway, we'll talk about that in the next video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.